Welcome everybody to the second Optimised webinar, Mobile Optimising Your Website. My name is Belinda Jones. I'm the Manager of International and Capability Building at Creative New Zealand, standing in for Helen Bartle this morning. I'm just getting used to the technology, so I see that I've actually let you all know a few minutes ago that I was just about to start the intro and the welcome, so you'll be one step ahead of me. Just a couple of short things before we get going and I introduce the presenter, Stuart Buchanan. Just to let you know that the star mute button star 6 is your mute button and your on and your unmute button. The structure of the webinar in the first half, Stuart will be giving a presentation, so we just advise you to push star mute, and then we'll have a break for questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself by pushing star 6, or use the Q&A box if you have a question. You can type a question at any point in the presentation, note it in the box, and then we can raise it during the question time. So just a general introduction about the topic. This is a very critical theme. It's very current. It's clear that a mobile optimised website is particularly significant, given potentially half the audience or more will be accessing your website on a mobile device in the year ahead. Creating a mobile optimised experience takes more than just making everything smaller. There are key considerations and opportunities that are unique to the mobile web environment. In this webinar, Stuart will be touching on things such as how to use the mobile web and how it differs from the desktop, how to maximise the opportunities that mobile offers to engage with your audience, steps you need to take with your web designers and developers to make this a reality, where mobile sits within digital, social media and content marketing strategies. But enough from me. I'd like to introduce our wonderful presenter, Stuart Buchanan, who's the Chief Executive of The Nest, a company that specialises in strategy, design and development for the cultural sector, and one that has devised award-winning mobile solutions for arts organisations such as Sydney Festival, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Biennale of Sydney and many more. You may also remember that Stuart has been a speaker at Creative New Zealand Conference and a presenter at one of Vicky Precious Hill's workshops. So I'll hand over to you now, Stuart. Welcome.
Thank you, Belinda, and good morning, everyone, from over here in Sydney. As Belinda mentioned, today's webinar is on mobile optimization. So let's follow along with the slides on screen. So just a recap of the 4 kind of key areas that we're going to cover off today, which is how do mobile sites differ from desktop? How do we maximize the opportunity that arises when we have that point of difference? How do we work with our designers and developers to make this a reality? And in that section, we're going to be looking at particularly the differences between what's known as a responsive site and a mobile site. And at the end, where does mobile sit within a broader digital social media or content strategy? Now, there will obviously be time for questions. We'll pause probably in the middle for some points of clarification, quick questions, and then we'll have some more time at the end as well. So let's get into it. Let's just look at some statistics. I mean, the fact that you're all here shows that you all have a keen interest in mobile. You're either all very excited or very terrified, or maybe even a combination of both. Right now, mobile is the #1 method for getting local information over any other, whether that's desktop or tablet. Within the next year or so, more internet users will be accessing web through mobile devices than through desktop. Now, if you read some of the accompanying blurb that was sent for this seminar, you'll have noticed that we sometimes refer to this as the mobile moment. I first heard that phrase a few months ago when somebody said, oh, look, I've had my mobile moment, which is that for the first time, visits from mobile have exceeded desktop. That actually happened to one of our clients, the Sydney Festival, this January, where the combined visits from mobile and tablet far exceeded desktop, getting up to about 55%. Now, we also noticed that during particularly key event days, some of the main public events that happen on the streets, that mobile figure could be as high as 75% in some cases. The next one there shows that about 90% of consumers searching on mobile devices will make a purchase within the next day. And this last piece here, which I'm not going to go into in a lot of detail, but it's important to know that the near-field communication, or sometimes referred to as NFC, or similar types of technology. I mean, there's a lot of people trialing a lot of different things here. Essentially, what this means is that mobile ticketing is going to represent more than half of mobile ticketing revenue within the next 2 years. So that's basically somebody walking into a venue and using their mobile device as their de facto ticket, so completely paperless ticketing. So that sort of obviously indicates that synergy between events and ticketing is going to get a lot more pronounced in the next year or so. So let's look at this first question of how does the use of mobile sites differ from desktop. Now, what I've done for this section is I've actually used a 6-stage audience journey map that was prepared by the Australia Council, because I thought this was actually quite a useful technique to show all the stages of the audience journey and how that might map to web use. So you can see here that these are very 6 common stages that we'll all recognize: awareness, becoming aware of your event, researching the event, booking, preparation, at the event, and after the event. So if I could just look at that in a little more detail and see, well, how will we use the web and what sort of things will we be using it for? So in the awareness stage, we'll first hear about the event either through a friend or other media, and generally that's coming through word of mouth, e-newsletters, social media. The next stage, finding out about the event, getting a little bit more detail, deciding whether or not, this is obviously the decision stage, deciding whether or not to attend. There I'm going to move on to probably using search engines, either to, either name of the event, name of the company, etc. Looking at the organization's website content. And that's not just sort of listings, that could be any content that's on there, whether that's blog articles, videos, etc. And obviously looking at reviews and recommendations from other websites. Get into booking, obviously buying a ticket ahead of time, so actually not on the door, if you like. Online ticketing and seating plans, very important there. We get into preparation, we're anticipating the event, we're getting organized, and we're looking for things like maps, journey planners, parking, restaurants, etc. At the event itself, getting more information about what it's about and this idea of sharing the experience. So we'll be sharing comments and photos via social media, getting more information about the artist and the event. And finally, after the event itself, so reliving the experience and considering possibly another attendance in the future. And there I'll be talking with others, letting them know what I thought about it, maybe recommending the event if it was good, and planning the next one. So if we could look at how that maps, I think here what we have is that desktop is certainly much more prominent in those early stages of the audience journey, really around the awareness and investigation stages. And I put there that idea that we should be thinking about the online the online journey at this point as being quite experiential. So we're trying to give people a real flavor of what the events are going to be, or what the event's going to be. We're trying to effectively sort of, what we would do through any other channel, trying to reel them in, to excite them, to enthuse them, to get them further down, if you like, that journey, so that we're moving into the booking stage. But it's very much about the bigger picture, the color, the experience. I've also put there, obviously, desktop is quite pertinent after the event itself, in terms of whether that's, for example, getting on Facebook and letting people know how much you enjoyed the event, etc. But if we look at, if we go to here and look at mobile, we'll see that the actual use case on a mobile is quite different. That actually mobile is much more around organization and around practical use, because people are generally using their mobile away from the desktop, obviously. They're not necessarily using it at work or at home when they might have access to either a home computer or a tablet. They're generally using it when they're out and about. So the main use case, not the only one, but the main use case is around organization and practicalities and this idea of utility. What can you do to make this part of the audience journey more helpful, effectively? So we're moving away from effectively selling the experience and moving into an area where we're helping people to get to the next stage of the journey. Now, in saying that, you'll see that the red dotted line also sort of extends to the left, because actually you'll see from one of the slides later that we're actually getting into a state now where a lot of those earlier components, as mobile optimization increases, that actually all of these earlier stages of the journey are achievable online. Whereas, let's say even 12 months ago when, there were far less mobile sites and mobile optimized sites around, a lot of this stuff was simply not achievable, particularly around the online booking stage of the journey. Now, of course, there are plenty of, particularly, the larger commercial ticket agents whose mobile experience is a lot better. In saying that, it's by no means ideal, and I think I've been here at the Nest, we work predominantly with arts organizations and cultural institutions, and part of the mobile strategy question is always, we might create a beautiful mobile experience on your website. What happens when you pass out to your ticketing supplier? Is that mobile experience just as good? Because it depends, I guess, whether or not your ticketing has been blended into your website, or whether you pass out to a third-party provider. And it's worth, obviously, ensuring that that third-party provider is giving the user a good mobile experience, because if you're going to invest time and resources and money in optimizing the mobile experience for the user, if they then trip into a ticketing experience from a third party that is less than optimal, then potentially you're going to lose that sale. So for a lot of people, you may already be in existing ticketing contracts that may run for quite a while, but if you're at the point where you're reconsidering a ticketing contract, then it's you really do have to make sure that your provider has a good mobile optimized experience, because certainly in my experience it's not always the case. So let's look at here. This statistic comes from Google, and what we're seeing here is what time of day that the mobile the differences between the various devices. And the lines on this graph are showing you when these devices are, the percentage of traffic used by the devices at that time. So where you can see where I've drawn the arrows in, this is where, if you like, the peak or optimal time for the different types of devices. And you'll see, I think quite obviously, when I look at desktop in the middle of the graph there, that it's peaking around lunch hour, because that's when people obviously have time to step away from the work that they're doing and spend more time online, whether that's through Facebook or whatever else they're doing. And you'll see obviously little peaks towards the end of the day as well, when you're getting to that sort of 4 or 5 o'clock malaise and starting to step back from work a little bit. So I don't think the desktop pattern is at all unusual. The red graph there is tablet, and the green one is smartphone. So we can see pretty clearly that tablet use is at lowest during the day, but actually at highest at around 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And again, that's people generally relaxing at home, whether that's in bed or in the sofa, and reading content on the tablet. The mobile, again, is once we get to that 6 o'clock mark, that mobile starts to increase and starts to continue to increase throughout the evening and peaking at around about 10 o'clock at night. So there's not really, I guess, when you consider it here, effectively what we're looking at is that the desktop is, the mobile is increasing as a social tool in social hours. So there's not much surprise when you interrogate that thought. So we're thinking about the fact that during the day we're getting high desktop traffic, but in the evening desktop starts to depreciate quite significantly and overtaken by mobile, and in this case tablet as well. It's worth noting, I mean, I'm often asked as well during social media strategy discussions about when is the best time to use social media. If any of you were at some of the optimized presentations that I was presenting at, you would have seen some slides that basically show what is, I think, quite commonsensical, which is that people use social media during social hours. So social media use peaks in the evening, but also peaks at the weekend particularly. So when we're thinking about messaging, we not only have to think, as we are looking at here, in terms of platform, so are our users going to be predominantly on mobile or desktop, but actually when are they online and when are they engaged? And really one of the things we need to be looking at when we're thinking about mobile sites is not only where are people going to be accessing this information, but when are they going to be accessing the information as well. Obviously, if social media is a key part of your digital strategy, you have to be able to maximize that as much as possible. So it can be quite challenging because obviously the social media use times are generally out with business times. So if, whether you're a marketing manager yourself or you have marketing resources in the organization, it's considering, well, that actually your audience is probably more to you, has a greater chance of connecting to you when you're out of the office and the office is closed. So we're working, for example, with some event organizations where we actually take care of their social media for them on-site at events in the evening and at weekends, and predominantly driving mobile through that. So how do we maximize the opportunity that the mobile web provides? Well, there's a couple of tips here that can get you started down this path. The first thing to ask really is what is useful? What is the useful content that you may already have on your website? So I recommend that the first thing to do is to draw up a sketch or a map of all the content that you have on your website. You can do this quite quickly in Excel. Really just sort of looking at each page that's on your website and what sort of content is on each page. Drawing up a sitemap and do a brief audit. And as you're going through this, start to think, well, is this more useful on a mobile or is it more useful on a desktop? And as you go through that process, page by page, very quickly see, I think, where the opportunities rise and where the difficulties may rise within this. And on that issue, the next question there is what's difficult? Once you've sort of got an idea of, or an audit rather, of all the content that you have on your site, look at the website functions itself and think, can people actually use some of the forms? Forms are particularly difficult on mobile. If your website uses a lot of tables, for example, the tables may be quite difficult to read when you resize those. If there's a lot of lengthy text, a lot of lengthy articles, how easy is it to access those on a mobile? So be thinking about, as I say, not just what's the type of content that's on the page, but the functions that are on the page as well. And other functions that simply don't work on a mobile. Now, a lot of older technology, I mean, people commonly note that Flash, for example, can't be used on Apple devices. Not many websites use Flash these days, so that's sort of passing out of significance. But certainly a lot of sites use what's known as JavaScript, which is a particular type of programming. And there are certain types of older JavaScript that really don't work well at all on mobile. So I think the way to go through this process is to open your current site on a mobile device and go through page by page and look at all the functions that are there and see whether there are some that are simply broken. Now, when I mean broken, I don't actually mean in terms of size, because we'll come to that in a second. I actually mean functionally broken. Like I can't tap a button doesn't work, or a form doesn't work, because the mobile browser works quite differently from the desktop browser. So really the stage here is to look at what actually breaks when you access the site on a mobile. I guess the sort of most important question out of the three is what's missing. You know, thinking about the user who is on the go, or who is in the vicinity of the venue, or who's close to purchase, what sort of information could be useful for them that you may not have at the moment? And some examples to think about are obviously transport information in terms of getting to the venue. And if you're providing maps on the website, can you provide either a Google map or a link to a Google map because sometimes when you design a sort of what looks like a beautiful custom design map for your website, that doesn't render well at all on a mobile. So certainly when using maps, I sort of think about and advocate making sure if you've got a custom map, make sure it's readable on mobile. But if you don't, then it's going to be far easier for the user if you just use a Google map. And make sure that the address that you have on the website, when you tap on that, it can access Google Maps just by putting in postcodes and so on. The browser will automatically identify it as an address. So transport information, location, food and beverage is really important to be able to say, particularly if a lot of people the main use case, I guess, particularly for attending evening performance events, is that they'll want to know where they can eat or drink either before or after. In a recent survey we did here in Australia with the Australia Council for the Arts, this was one of the big mismatches between what the audience wanted and what arts organizations were providing. The other big one was around duration of events. So people really want to know those practical information about how long is this going to last, should I eat before or after, what time do I need to tell the babysitter I'm going to be back at, etc. So real practical information. Twitter is great to use not just to share information, but here this sort of idea of late-breaking information, because depending on how your website is designed, if there's a particular change to a performance, whether that's a performer or venue or a time or whatever, having a Twitter feed on the website, and particularly on the mobile site, is great, and having that surface quite high up on the site, great for being able to get that sort of late-breaking information coming through, particularly if you've got an event that's quite a large-scale public event, let's say, or a festival, where there is a lot of potential for change. Then having something like a Twitter feed is very easy and simple to use. The other thing to consider is this idea of social feeds from other users, and what I mean by that is rather than just showing, let's say, if you use Instagram, for example, or Twitter, rather than just showing content that's yours, showing content that's been hashtagged by other users that's relevant for your organization. So, for example, one organization I'm looking at, they may post, I'm working with just now rather, they may post something like 10 or 12 Instagram photos in a week, whereas people who are at their space, which is a large public space here in Sydney, people who are at their space will post upwards of 1,200 photos a week, hashtagged with the name of their space. So they have an option to say, well, do we just present our photos, or do we present everybody's photos that are hashtagged with their venue, and they've got a lot to choose from. So that's certainly worth thinking about there. I might just pause for questions or points of clarification before we continue. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thanks so much, Stuart. That's been fantastic so far. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Feel free to push *6 if you'd like to ask a question, or you can email us in the box. Perhaps if you're all percolating those words of wisdom, I might just ask Vicky if you have any thoughts or comments from the work that you've been doing in this area.
Oh, sure. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yeah, that's great. Stuart, this is fantastic stuff so far. So one of the things I'm really interested in is your talk about people are using mobile phones in a different way, so there's a different use case for them. And as you know, we've been doing the benchmarking statistics from Optimizer, and we've been seeing that the average duration for website visits on mobile phones is a lot lower than for websites and tablets, which obviously we expect. And one way of looking at that is saying, well, it's because people are getting a poor experience because it's not, they're primarily not mobile optimized or responsive websites. But could it also be, do you think, are you seeing lower durations? Even when websites are optimized for mobile, are you seeing lower durations on a mobile phone because the use case is different, or do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so I think it's right. I mean, I think, certainly in some cases, if it's a poor experience, then someone's going to leave quite quickly. But actually, the converse is, or rather, the converse use case is also true insofar as if you have a mobile optimized site, somebody finds the information they're looking for very quickly and therefore leaves very quickly. Because the use case isn't necessarily a very long, what we might call dwell time. Once I've got the information I'm looking for, because it's more this sort of utility and practical information. Once I've got that, I'm less inclined to then say, oh, look, here's a blog post by the artistic director. I'm going to sit and read that now on my mobile. Maybe if you're on public transport and got some time to kill, but generally you're conscious that you're getting in, you're going for some particular piece of information or a particular function and getting out again. So even when we start to compare optimized versus non-optimized, then definitely the duration time is still far less than a desktop site. Now, interestingly, the corollary to that is when we look at tablet devices, which sort of fall within this area, is that actually dwell time on tablet devices is much, much higher. Because as I said earlier, the main use case for a tablet is at home, where there isn't the impetus to, you're not on the go, you're not having to get somewhere quickly, quite the opposite. And in fact, the average duration of a website visit on a tablet, and Vicky, you can probably give us some stats around the optimized, but certainly in many cases in most cases they're more than double, and in many cases quite significantly higher than that. So it's worth thinking, about the fact that you may be having a spread of different content types on your website, but not all those content types are going to be accessed by everybody on the same device. Some are going to be accessed on desktop, some more on tablet, and some more on mobile. And it's about optimizing that experience for each one.
Yes, yes. And I think as we all start to reach that mobile moment, it's also about thinking about other things people are doing on mobile. So they're also reading email on mobile. And I thought that was, you said something about mobile use, peaking at weekends, did you? I think you said that earlier on.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, out of the Optimizer benchmarking program, we're finding that open rates of email are actually higher at the weekend than during the week, but also the click rate is lower at the weekend than during the week. And when we delve into that further, I wonder if we will find that more people are opening their email on mobile during the week, but not clicking because they don't want to go further because they are on mobile. So it's just interesting I think thinking about all the things that our customers are doing on mobile, not just looking at a website, but also social sites and email too, I think is really important.
Yeah, and it's worth noting on email that mobile email clients, like, for example, the iPhone email and Android email, now exceed desktop clients. So more people read their email on mobile than they do in desktop. And this has particularly strong ramifications for your e-newsletter design. I'm not going into that because we're really talking more about mobile web optimization, but I will make a comment about it now, which is really making sure that you're optimizing your email design for mobile. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to move to what is effectively a sort of single column email design. That's by far and away the easiest way to optimize for email. There are other ways to do it that are more complicated, more technically complicated and design complicated, but I think if you stick to your single column approach or a rough variant of that, then that's a very good starting point.
Thanks.
So I might continue.
Actually, sorry, Stuart, I've just got one more question from Susan, and that is, how do you track mobile versus desktop activity or visits to your site?
Yes, that's a good question. Google Analytics has all that information bedded in. So when you access Google Analytics, on the menu therein, you'll see a section called Technology, and under that menu section, you'll see a section called Devices. And there you can see the difference between, they break it down between desktop, mobile, and tablet. And within each of those, they'll then start to break it down by device type. You can get a top level, which is things like Apple versus Android, or you can go even further and see all the various different devices, the Samsungs versus Nokias, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Google Analytics has all the answers there. It's just a question of drilling down to find them. But the very basic one you're looking for in Google Analytics is around devices, is around technology, and looking at the single screen that has desktop, mobile, and tablet. That's where you'll get the key information that you're looking for. Is that all right?
Lovely. I think that sounds good. Do you want to continue now, Stuart? We'll have time maybe for questions at the end, perhaps.
Cool. Okay. So let's ask this. The next question then is how we make this a reality. Now, the two things that I'm going to talk about here are a responsive website and a mobile site. Now, don't get confused about the fact that this word responsive doesn't have the word mobile in it, because effectively what responsive is, a responsive website is one that will change its layout depending on where it's viewed. Okay, so it's one website that has what's called style sheets, different style sheets, that will be displayed according to its environment. So how websites are generally built is that we separate, excuse me, the coding behind a website is generally separated into HTML, so that's the code that's going to determine what text and what images and so on to display on the page. And then something called style sheets, or CSS you might have heard it referred to. And these style sheets determine the style or layout of the page. And that style can include things like tables and colors and fonts and so on and so forth. Now the great thing about this, and this is why this is sort of one of the good early breakthroughs of the web, is that I can change the style, excuse me, and that style is applied to all the pages in my website. So let's say I had 10 pages in a website. I might have 10 HTML pages, but I've only got one style sheet that goes across the whole site. So I make a change on the style sheet, and that change goes across the whole site. I don't get too into that, but hopefully conceptually you can sort of grasp what I'm talking about. Now, what a responsive website does is it sort of introduces this idea where instead of there just being one style that's applied across the whole site, it introduces a second style, which is optimized for mobile. So what that means is it's still the same one website, it just has different styles applied to it. One style being desktop and one style being mobile. Now I've said here on the screen that actually a responsive site can have up to 2 or 3 different styles, or what's sometimes referred to as breakpoints. I put that in because you might hear that phrase being used. All it basically means is a different style. So we generally make a decision here at the Nest between 2 or 3 breakpoints, or 2 or 3 styles, and that is basically desktop, mobile, and tablet. Now what we're doing, and what we've started to do over the last 12 months, is actually we're finding that our desktop and tablet experience is merging a little, just because we're getting, I guess, better at optimizing for tablet. So generally what we find, and this is an interesting side note, is that instead of designing for desktop, when somebody comes to us and wants a new website design, instead of designing for desktop first, we're actually sort of designing for tablet, because we actually find that tablet displays very well as a desktop site, whereas the same isn't always true. A desktop site doesn't always work well on tablet, predominantly to do with size of buttons and size of text and so on. So really we're getting away from effectively a different tablet style or different tablet breakpoint, and just optimizing for tablet, and desktop is the same style. So hopefully that makes sense. Effectively what we're seeing on screen here is the Sydney Dance Company website that we launched a couple of weeks ago. And what we have, you can see, if you look at the screen there, these are all the same elements are on the page, because it's the same HTML, it's the same page, but just we have on the left was effectively the desktop style, and on the right we have the mobile style. So same content, all the same elements, but what the style is doing here, as you can see, is saying, okay, when you've got mobile, instead of having 3 columns, let's have 2 columns. So that's just a change of style. Okay, the actual underlying code, the HTML, hasn't changed at all. It's just the style's gone from 3 columns to 2 columns. The image size has increased, or rather the relationship between the image has increased, And what we're also able to do with this process, for example, is we've collapsed the menu into this single button. So you can see, hopefully on the right-hand side, a little icon, which you might be now quite familiar with, which is essentially the kind of menu icon for mobile. And when I tap that, the mobile drops down. So as this process of responsive has got more and more mature, we're able to do more and more with it, insofar as this thing like the menu, for example, because the menu behaves in a very different way to desktop, but again, it's still just this process of using different styles. So hopefully that you can ask some questions if you don't quite follow on that. But let me now go to a mobile site. Mobile site is different because a mobile site is actually one that's been designed exclusively for mobile. And what this is it's effectively a second website, okay? One that might be using the same content, but the actual underlying HTML in this case is actually different. So what you end up with is effectively two websites. But generally what happens in development is they'll both use the same content management system. So you needn't worry about, do I need to suddenly maintain two websites? Same content management system, but essentially what it's doing is it's pushing the content to what is effectively two different websites. So the difference, I'll just get back to responsive. So here's responsive. This is effectively one website with two styles, you can see here, one website with different styles. And here on mobile, it's effectively two websites, albeit using the same content. So there's quite a bit of nuanced difference there. I've shown a kind of Sydney Festival example. And while obviously stylistically, you can see here, stylistically, these are similar insofar as we're obviously using the same fonts, colors, and so on. You'll see, for example, on the right-hand side, these sort of 4 mobile buttons there. These don't exist on the desktop side. These are completely unique to the mobile side. And, there are specific buttons that are more useful for mobile. So, for example, what's on today? That's obviously a very common one. But here, venues nearby, what's near me, which we wouldn't necessarily need to use or have a use case for on the desktop side. So there clearly is a function or a feature that is perfect for mobile and has a great mobile use case and doesn't really have the same strength of use case on desktop. So that's a mobile side. So your next question, I suppose, is, well, which one do we use? Because that would be my next question. So generally we use responsive when there's a really good crossover of your sort of main content, your hero content, when there's a good crossover of content between desktop and mobile, and when you feel that there's a similar page layout and structure. So when you look at your existing website, particularly if it's been built in the last few years, you might find that actually the design and the content and the structure lends itself reasonably well to the mobile experience, so you don't have to be making a lot of radical changes. So where the optimization is more of is less dramatic, if you like. You would use responsive. I'd probably recommend if you're starting from scratch, because building a new website, for example, because certainly doing a responsive site can be much more economical, and certainly in the long term, you've got much less to look after, because essentially if you're using a mobile site, as I said, you're effectively building two sites. So you've sort of, not from a content point of view, but from a design point of view, sort of got two sites to look after in some respects. You also use responsive if your current website doesn't use any Flash or any of that old JavaScript that I talked about. Now, it's depending on what sort of developer you use, this idea of taking an existing website, and this is an important point to know, take an existing website and make it responsive. Now, this is something that's only really come into play in the last year or even less. And before that, I think if you asked even us or any developer if this was something that they could do, they may well sort of either scratch their head or sort of say, look, it's just too hard. Now it's actually getting easier to take an existing website and create a new style that is responsive. So it isn't a case of having to throw your old website out if you want a responsive site. You can now create this second style, responsive style, with an existing site. Again, there's a whole bunch of dependencies in there around the technology that was used to build your site, how recently it was done, but that's certainly one thing to investigate. and something to ask your developer about. Now, you would use a separate mobile site, but there is a very markedly different content between desktop and mobile. I think Sydney Festival is a good example. There's a very marked difference in use case between desktop and mobile. The page layouts and structure need something that's quite radically different. If your current website, if it's a little bit older and your developer quite rightly says, look, we just can't make this responsive, you don't want to go back to the beginning again, then that would be a case for building a mobile version of the current website. And also be using mobile if your current website does use any Flash or any old JavaScript as well. So to recap there, I think we're using responsive when you're either starting from scratch or you've got a reasonably recent website and you think that the content is broadly similar. So I would, if I was using a very broad brushstroke here, I would say you'd probably use responsive when it's either new or recent. Use mobile if you've got an existing site that's a little bit older. That's probably a reasonably good brushstroke to work with. Other things to think about in terms of design and development considerations. I mentioned this earlier. Do you need a tablet solution as well? So as you're going through the process that we discussed earlier of sort of doing a bit of an audit on your site on mobile, do the same on tablet, and particularly be looking at things like button sizes, because remember that some of us have very delicate fingers, some of us don't have very delicate fingers, some of us have very big fingers, and it's definitely the case that some buttons are just too small to be tapped with a finger as opposed to with a mouse. So be checking things like button sizes, checking that the text size is readable. I've mentioned Flash and JavaScript before. I guess one of the other common things that's sort of related to JavaScript is scrolling. If you're using any frames in your website, depending on how that's coded, it just might not work on an iPad. I'm working with a company at the moment making a responsive version of their old website where they have frames and scrolls, and they just simply don't work on iPad, so we have to recode that as part of the process. The next thing to think about, and this opens up a huge subject matter that we could have a whole other webinar on at some other time, which is around there's a new phrase emerging. Well, it's not really new, but we're hearing it a lot more as we start talking about optimization, is this idea of content design. And when we're talking about content design, we don't mean graphic design. We actually mean the way in which the content itself has been created. And so if let's say we take a common, let's take an article. Let's say an article that's 500 words long. You would think, well, look, there's a headline and there's body copy in that article. Actually, when we talk about content design, we say there's a headline, there's a byline, there's a creator, there's a creation date, there's an introduction, there's an extract, there's an outro. You can take that article and you can slice it up in lots and lots of different ways. And the reason I mention this is because when we think about responsive and using these style sheets, what we're able to do, for example, is say, look, if I have an article, and if I've been clever about the way that this article has been saved into my CMS, and let's say I've got an extract, a field that just says extract, then you can say in a mobile style sheet, don't show the whole article, just show the extract. So the more that you can sort of break the content up into these digestible chunks, and the more options you have in responsive to just show those chunks as opposed to showing the whole thing. So this is the idea of content design, about looking at how you can take existing content and break it up, thinking about which platform it's going to be it's going to be used in. So that's definitely something to consider. And I think if you want to sort of wrap your head around that a little bit more, the easiest thing to do is think about this idea of wearable technology that you might have heard about, which in some cases sounds absurd and quite ridiculous. But I think one of the kind of things that is quite likely to happen in the next little while is having some sort of wrist device, some watch-style device, where we can access some sorts of functions from apps and such like. So how do we take our content and show that at a screen size that might be a couple of inches, whilst at the same time, how do we take our content and prepare it for somebody sitting at home accessing the web through a 50-inch screen? Getting to the point where the size of screen isn't necessarily limited to desktop and mobile. As we sort of project ahead for a year or two, we're starting to think about screens getting much, much bigger and much, much smaller at the same time. So responsive design is good to think about, because you can be responding to all the new screen sizes that might come in the future. So responsive design is good to think about. And also what I've just been talking about, this idea of the CMS and content design, being able to be much more flexible with your content in terms of having it in digestible chunks, if you like. So another thing to get your head around, and this is where it starts to get, has the potential to really fry your brain. So when you start to look at this, you'll be pleased to hear that you don't actually have to necessarily take this information in on this screen. But I just wanted to show, here's two examples of popular phones, both of which have different screen sizes in terms of pixels, but also this other little number below where you see on the left-hand side it says 441 ppi. Pretty much all devices have a different, what's called screen density. So we're now dealing with the case, and actually I've put that little note there, hundreds more. If you actually go to Wikipedia and type in screen density, there's lists of hundreds and hundreds of different phones, all have different sizes, all have different densities. And to try and design for that, accommodate that, has the potential, as I say, to really melt anyone's brain. But I think the easiest way to think about it is to put this slide away from your mind and think about it like this. What I've done here is I've shown you the three main common use cases at the moment, which are desktop, tablet, and I've shown it in two orientations. So remember that obviously you can be orientating your tablet, portrait or landscape, and smartphone. And the easiest way to think about this in terms of design is that smartphone generally should be single column. That's pretty much a golden rule of designing the smartphone, single column site. Tablet generally can be either single if it's in portrait or double if it's in landscape, so you may be using 2 columns, and in desktop you might be going to 3 or 4 columns. So really, rather than trying to worry about screen sizes and screen densities on a per device level, is thinking about design more from a column base. And thinking about if it's a smartphone design, it's single column, tablet it might be 2. You can go to 3 on desktop, but again, remember what I said earlier about trying to find a sweet spot between tablet and desktop design, because that's sort of where we're coming from now. So this is quite an easy and hopefully a bit of a nice rule of thumb when thinking about, particularly around responsive design. So let's, before we get on to questions, let's just think about how mobile sits within a broader strategy. And here I've sort of outlined, I guess, what are 5 key, by no means the only digital channels, but I guess 5 key channels that we'll be customarily using, and some thoughts about each, how that might sit in a strategy. So when thinking about a website, which is generally around information, listings, context, commentary, etc., the global average now is 28% of all visits coming from mobile, and as I've noted earlier, about 50% or over for public events. And worth noting that mobile connection speed more than doubled in 2013, so the ability for people to access information on the go has considerably improved. Now this statistic alone is one worth considering if you're thinking about building an app, because it used to be the case that in some cases apps were preferred because you could access content faster, because a lot of that content came bundled with the app when you downloaded it, let's say a festival app, for example. And the argument for apps was, well, I can access content faster because it's all saved on my phone. Now with mobile connection speeds being the way they are, we're seeing that actually content can be accessed quite fast, and that sort of use case for an app has diminished. Now I think the only use case for an app is really if it's something that you simply cannot do on a website, then that would be a use case for an app. But there's really no use in replicating website functionality within an app now. Facebook, around 50% of their active users only use mobile. And that's a pretty significant statistic. And their advertising revenue is now over 50% coming from mobile. Twitter, around 3/4 of monthly users use mobile device. And the same figure again in terms of their advertising revenue, 75%. So Twitter, obviously Twitter is very much about what's happening now. So you can understand why there's a good mobile use case there. YouTube, mobile accounted for over 50% of all video traffic. So watching video is no longer a pursuit that is exclusive to desktop. Quite the opposite. Mobile is now watched on, video is now watched on mobiles more than desktop. And 80% of YouTube's traffic is outside of US. And finally here, Instagram, which if you haven't gone on to Instagram yet, then here's a couple of good reasons why. Their user base has doubled in the last 12 months. It was acquired by Facebook a few months ago for $1 billion. There's now 180 million monthly active users on Instagram, spending on average over 4 hours a month on Instagram, which is a phenomenal amount of time browsing beautiful photographs. I guess that's noting that if you're using all of these channels, that actually all of these channels are now predominantly or pushing towards predominantly being mobile use. So we're not thinking about these channels as desktop channels. We're actually now having to think mobile first when we're thinking about all of these channels. Now, here's a couple of other things I wanted to show in terms of strategy. There's 3 slides here to conclude with, which comes from the Australia Council for the Arts. And really what I wanted to emphasize here is this is in the early stages of the audience journey. You're seeing that this is now about 2 years ago. They haven't done a subsequent updated survey, so I think the statistics here would be you could actually add to them to get some more recency to them. Essentially, at the research stage, we're seeing obviously a very large percentage of people using online. I don't think any of the figures here are at all surprising. When we get on to the next stage and we look at the event itself, we're seeing now at this stage, I think given that this is 2 years old, I would think that the gray section, which is people who are interested in doing it but hadn't yet done it, the gray section, I think we could almost color all of these red now. So essentially saying at the event itself, there's a large percentage of people who use the mobile to find information about the event or the artists, who updated their Facebook status, used it to see if anyone else was commenting. What else are they saying about it? Is everybody having as good or as bad a time as I am? And uploaded a photo or a video to networking sites. So these are all things happening at the event. Now, if you're a venue-based organization, you really have to consider your policy around mobile phones in venue. I think the general rule of thumb is that if it's a theater production, then that mobile phones should be turned off during the production. But conversely, during the interval or after the event, that making sure there's good Wi-Fi in the building so that people can share their experience quite quickly and happily. So I think that's probably, if you have to shut it down while the performance is in progress, and when the performance isn't in progress, make sure you're giving people good, fast access. And finally here, the one that is of considerable importance to us, which is after the event, because this is the one that's usually forgotten about. We're generally, when we use a lot of these channels, we're trying to get people to the event or telling them what's going to happen when they get there. And actually what we see here is that actually more people are using it after the event than they are before or during. So what is the strategy for after the event? So again, thinking about when people are finishing with the event or leaving the event, how can you catch them at that point where they've had a good experience and you want them to share that experience with their friends, because that's going to be, that's what's going to drive critical engagement. What can you do to facilitate that? Certainly having good Wi-Fi is important, but letting people know, for example, what the hashtag might be for a particular event or what your Twitter profile is, and that goes through signage, that goes through programs, it goes through ticketing, letting people know at all stages of the journey that not only is it acceptable, here's what you would like them to do, i.e. hashtag and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's my slide, which was a very swift and introduction to this area. Hopefully I've covered all of the main points, but I appreciate there's probably a lot more detail underneath this. So please feel free to either type some questions into the box or ask them over the phone.
Thank you so much, Stuart. That is a lot of food for thought, and we do have 5 minutes left. So if anybody would like to ask a question, star 6. I keep doing that. Sorry, star 6 to unmute yourself or type a question in.
You want me to ask?
Is that somebody wanting to say something? No? Okay. Vicky, did you have any comments?
It's really great that you talked about breakpoints, Stuart, and also about the different orientations on tablets and mobile. I just wondered, is there no need to have different breakpoints for the landscape and portrait orientations, say, on a tablet? Is this handled by style sheets? How is that handled?
Yeah, so that again, that's handled by the style sheet. So it recognizes when it's in a particular orientation because due to the screen width.
Yes.
So essentially, you've got a couple of options. I'm just going to pan back here to
Sure.
earlier screen. You've got a couple of options within the style sheets, which is that how they work is that they are either looking at screen size,
Yes.
or they're looking at the browser type. So basically, what I'm saying is that in the style sheet, you'll say if you're accessing using this particular browser, then show this style sheet. Or it's saying if your browser size is XYZ, then show this particular style sheet. So you can get a good, if you're interested in this area, you can get quite a good view of it by just going to a desktop browser, finding a responsive site. Dance Company is a good example, but there are plenty of them, and just literally moving your browser, making your browser window smaller in terms of making it thinner and thinner. And a responsive site will actually collapse, even though it's still using a desktop browser, because it's discovered that the browser size is a lot smaller. It will collapse into a responsive side. So within that, you can be, as I say, you don't necessarily need to be targeting quote-unquote smartphone, tablet, and desktop. You're really just targeting width of screen, width of browser.
Yes.
Yeah. So within the portrait and landscape orientation, you might determine, for example, that in landscape orientation, and this sort of breakpoint may be 2 column, it may be 3, but in portrait it's going to 1 because the breakpoint, if you like, that moves from 2 column to 1 is somewhere between the width of the portrait and the landscape on the tablet.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Stuart, we've just got a couple of questions here about the responsive sites, and we've got a couple of minutes left. So one of the questions is regarding what sort of content management systems are used for responsive sites, and the other question is, can you recommend a good CMS as a place to start looking at responsive design?
Well, most content management suppliers are very conscious of responsive. So if you're depending on what CMS you're using, and you're using a recent version of it, then most of the good commonly used CMSs will accommodate it quite well. Because the thing is, the style sheet is often quite not entirely disassociated from the CMS, but there's a lot of flexibility that isn't necessarily tied to the CMS, depending on how it's being coded. So really the sort of CMS question is partially more around what sort of CMS do you need for your content, as opposed to for responsive design. Although I should note that yes, a good CMS that gives you that. Remember when I was talking about content design in terms of being able to break things down? So really the sort of what you're looking for in a CMS requirement is saying, if I'm looking at the CMS and I have 3 fields, let's say, to describe an article, can I add more fields? Can I add 3 more fields? And so that the developer can use those fields to show on mobile as opposed to desktop. So it really depends on the flexibility is, can I use more fields? How can I extend the content management system in that way? Something like WordPress, for example, and a lot of the other open source systems allow you to do that quite easily. So for example, WordPress comes out of the box with, let's say, I don't know, off the top of my head, 6 or 7 different components that might describe an article, but you can add what's known as custom fields and put as many of those in as you like to say, well, when on mobile, use this field, and when on desktop, use this field. So it's really about how can the CMS accommodate content design as opposed to the sort of style sheet design.
Lovely, thank you, Stuart, and that leads us to the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, because I'm sure that there's a lot more that we could discuss, but I do want to thank you very much, Stuart, for your wonderful presentation. You have illustrated some really significant trends around mobile use, demonstrating it's really something that we can't ignore, and offered some valuable insights into the options available for mobile optimization, as well as some practical tips. Just to let you all know that a video of the presentation and a copy of the slides will be made available on our website within the next week, and you'll also receive notification Cassandra for next month's webinar, and that is called Measuring Your Social Media Effort. Put it in your calendars now for the Wednesday the 26th of March. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you again next month. Thank you.